have been a long time hater of caffeine, and because of this, I've had many stages of my life where I have just quit entirely, but I've also gone through many stages where I can't quit no matter how hard I try. In the times where I have been completely caffeine free, usually for about 2 to 4 months at a time, I'm at my absolute happiest. So even though I myself cannot get to a point where I can let go entirely, I hope I can convince you guys to do it first. Hello, beautiful people of the internet. My name is Jaden. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I post a lot of lifestyle content and also self-improvement type of videos. So if you're interested in any of that, do be sure to click the subscribe button down below. Before I really get into this, I have to preface that I've never been a person who has really used caffeine a lot. When I was at my absolute worst, I was having 2, maybe 3 sodas a day, but even that was pretty rare. My typical amount was just like 1 soda a day, usually a Dr. Pepper or a cherry Pepsi at like 7:30 in the morning before work. I have never drank coffee and I've never drank an energy drink, so I don't even have an idea of what it's like to go into 200 to 300 milligrams of caffeine every day, and honestly I hope I never do. So I'm very aware that my experience will not be relatable to the majority of people, especially those who have a really bad caffeine problem. I also know that my journey to quitting will be less impactful to these people who maybe do use more caffeine, but I still think it's important to talk about it. So at this point in my life, I am currently not caffeine free. I do have soda maybe like once or twice a week. Sometimes I do have really bad weeks where I'm having it nearly every day, but I did successfully kill the daily habit and kind of that thoughtless pickup of a drink regardless of if I wanted it or not. And I'm okay with where I am now because I don't feel like the caffeine controls me anymore. I feel like I make the decision every day on if I want to use it or not. But never forget that me getting to that point actually had to start with a full-blown purge. So these were my motivations to quit for a solid 3 months. First, teeth staining. One of the things I've been wanting to improve more is my appearance. I'm not the biggest fan of things that you have to constantly upkeep, like nails and lashes and dyeing hair, all of that. They're just all very frustrating for me, so I try to do the things that will make the most impact with me not having to do that much work and don't require a lot of maintenance in the future. So when I wanted my teeth to get wider, instead of being like, I'm gonna use whitening strips, I was like, I'm gonna cut out soda. And while this motivation was solely based upon aesthetics, once I did a bit more research, the fact that caffeine, especially acidic drinks like sodas, will erode your teeth over time and will stain them, that was just something that just kind of turned me off to the idea of using it. Second, pregnancy. I'm not pregnant yet and probably won't be for a while, but I would like to have children eventually. And when I'm ready to do so, I don't want any caffeine in my system. I know that according to research, 200 milligrams of caffeine can generally be safe for pregnancy, but it's one of those things where you always see the advice that less is more. It's always better to have none than even just a little. It's also been studied that in both males and females that caffeine use can cause a fertility decrease and an increase in miscarriage risk. So, you know, being someone that does want kids, that's just, again, a huge turn off for me. 3, unnatural additives. I have a bone to pick with anything quote unquote unnatural that we as humans add into our bodies that wasn't there before we like invented it, or at least wasn't as normalized, because I know caffeine is natural in nature. Natural in nature is kind of redundant, but you get the point. But that's actually why I've come off birth control and SSRIs, and I've nearly cut out all alcohol usage. Again, where I have the means to do so, I try my best. And I'm not saying this to demonize SSRIs or birth control or alcohol or eating fast food, anything like that. It's all a personal preference. It comes down to people's personal journeys. I don't think anything negative about people who use or consume any of those things. It's just how I like to go about my life so that I can feel my best. I've always felt like we as a society are moving too far away from like living with the elements. So whatever way I can be more aligned to living, again, naturally, I try to do. Number 4, sugar. I always knew that I liked the caffeine in the sodas, but I really think it had more to do with the sugar. I have fully quit sugar before as well. I know what it's like for me to be 100% off of sugar, and that was 10,000% a more difficult journey than me cutting caffeine. Once again, with cutting cutting caffeine, I want to take the path of least resistance when it comes to cutting sugar, and cutting caffeine is a stepping stone for fully cutting sugar for me. So it just kind of became a win-win in my eyes. Number 5, hormones. When I was getting really into cycle syncing, which is basically just syncing up your lifestyle to your menstrual cycle as a woman or someone who does bleed, I was noticing that a lot of the advice for all of cycle syncing was to minimize caffeine use. When you really look into it, caffeine just seems to amplify any negative symptoms that you will have hormonally. So it kind of was just a curiosity thing for me if I cut caffeine altogether, if it would make my cycle better. And lastly, my 6th point is general health. Kind of what I mentioned about pregnancy. Caffeine definitely is safe and fine in moderation, but less is always more. So since I had the means to cut it out, I was like, why not? So I definitely had some concerns and some fears when I decided I was going to cut caffeine. And truly, my biggest fear was being cognitively stunted in any way. Caffeine was really a mental crutch for me, and I felt like I needed it to perform at my absolute best, especially when it came to higher stress situations at work, or when I needed to be creative, or when I needed to socialize. I used to have really bad social anxiety, which would very often make me stumble over my words, or just generally not make a lot of sense when it came to speaking to other people. Cognitive performance can be positively affected by the use of caffeine, and generally problem-solving abilities, processing speed, and memory all have a positive correlation with caffeine use. On the days where I would skip caffeine, I would notice that my struggles in these areas would be really amplified. I would just make less sense overall, have trouble explaining things, have trouble remembering things. Like, it came to a point where I was having trouble remembering the lyrics to my favorite songs that I knew all the lyrics to and I had sang millions of times before. So I knew that my brain was just not functioning as well as it was before. And with my social anxiety, I felt like everyone all around me could notice when I wasn't performing as well as I could have been. So basically my biggest fear was that I would never be able to exist at that higher functioning level without caffeine. But that was not true. Fast forward to me actually quitting, and I had noticed that the withdrawal period for me was actually a lot shorter than I thought it would be, and a lot shorter than it was for other people. I really tried hard to find information that linked daily caffeine consumption and how long the withdrawal period would take, but I can't find anything on it. Everything that I look up says that the withdrawal period can last up to 9 days, but I've definitely seen people take longer than that to recover. I would say that I struggled for about 3 days in total. It was not easy to power through those 3 days. It was a lot harder to not take any naps, and it was harder to fall asleep at night. But overall, very tolerable withdrawal period. Very easy, very fast. I mean, in comparison to the fact that I've suffered from sugar withdrawals, SSRI withdrawals, and birth control withdrawals, I would say that this was the easiest of them all. But again, difference in intensity matters a lot. During those 3 days of withdrawals, getting things done at work took double the effort. I noticed myself making more typos and having to think a lot longer about every sentence I said and reread every email that I sent. Just a bunch of stuff like that. There are many different withdrawal symptoms that you can get from cutting caffeine, but the only thing that I really saw an increase in was brain fog, headaches, and fatigue. But just a reminder that caffeine withdrawal is considered a disorder, and it should be treated as what it is, a drug withdrawal, because caffeine is a drug. My experience really wasn't that bad, but it's only because I wasn't that bad with my caffeine use. The more caffeine you intake, the harder it's going to be to cut it all out. And this goes for all drug use, whether a more common one or not. Now that I am mostly caffeine free and past all of the withdrawal effects, the major benefit that I've noticed is that I'm much more leveled out. Being that I am a woman, I'm always trying to find things that make me more consistent, because it seems like everything in our lives is trying to prevent us from having that. I now feel like my mood is a bit more predictable throughout the day. I actually don't have that 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. crash that a lot of girls do say that they have, and I don't really have mood swings outside of my typical hormones from my period. It's said that caffeine use can lead to changing estrogen levels in women, which is not good for us. This can potentially lead to endometriosis, certain types of cancer, and a worse menopause experience. And these estrogen levels can either increase or decrease depending on your racial group, which is weird. I don't really understand that, but overall it takes away our balance of our hormones. And as women, we really try to thrive on balanced hormones. Similar to the estrogen situation, caffeine may increase the testosterone in men and decrease it in women. There's not a lot of research on it, but if the studies are true, I think it makes sense why motivation levels decrease through the withdrawal process and why a lot of those mood changes changes can look like depression. In women, lower testosterone levels can lead to sluggishness, decreased sexual satisfaction, reduced sex drive, fertility issues, and irregular periods. Basically things that none of us want. In addition to all these other hormones, caffeine actually increases cortisol levels, which just means that our stress levels become higher. It decreases our serotonin levels, which makes us less happy long term, and in contrast, it increases our dopamine levels, which has a lot more to do with short-term happiness, and it increases our oxytocin levels, which is the love hormone. So what we're seeing with all this information is that caffeine can make us happy in the moment, but it throws off our hormonal balance and makes us more unhappy in the long run. The reason why I'm talking so much about women in the hormonal aspect of it is that women's hormones are much more complex and much less straightforward than a man's. Mainstream media has been talking about this a little bit more lately, but it's still not enough. As women, I feel that we really need to focus more on our health because all of these adverse effects really take a harder hit on us. If you recognize that pregnant women are pretty much the only targeted group for being advised not to use caffeine, it makes a lot of sense why. I definitely have noticed my cycle being less hard on me with the decrease of caffeine use. My symptoms are truly not as bad as they used to be. At some point, I will be making an entire cycle syncing guide once I get good enough at it to know what I'm talking about. But for now, I will just say that cutting caffeine use is a game changer for cycle syncing. I've also noticed that I sleep better at night, which is crazy to me based on how I went about my caffeine use. It's recommended to not have caffeine 6 hours or less before you go to sleep. I definitely followed this practice every single day, excluding rare occasions where I was going out to like a party or something, or I had to stay up late to drive somewhere. So you would think I wouldn't really have trouble sleeping. So did I, but now that I've cut the caffeine use almost entirely, I can say that I sleep better than I did before. There are like a million articles on sleep and its ties to caffeine usage. I'll link a couple down in the description below, but I do think that it is a well-known concept that caffeine use does mess with sleep. One thing that I did not expect to get better and I really wasn't holding out on was my nausea and my lightheadedness. Every time that I would wake up a little bit earlier than usual, or I just wanted to hold out on my caffeine use a little bit and I would delay the process, so I'd maybe be having caffeine like a couple hours later than I usually would, I would get so sick. The funny thing is, I also think that drinking the soda was making me sick. I have acid reflux and it's not as bad as it was when I was a kid, but it was significantly worse when I was drinking a lot of soda. So at first it was this really weird trade-off. I thought that I just had this natural sickness in the morning and that nothing would make it go away. Turns out I think it was literally just caffeine withdrawals, and that even when I would have the sugary soda, then that would cause my acid reflux and it would make me have a similar reaction. Once I cut the caffeine out altogether and then I got over the withdrawal period, the symptoms completely went away. But it's really important to note that I did a bunch of other things during this time, like I started eating breakfast and I started taking vitamins and I started drinking more water. So yes, there's definitely other elements that came into it, but at the end of the day, I could wake up at 5 a.m. and not feel sick now. And speaking of those vitamins, caffeine actually inhibits your ability to absorb vitamins. So even if you do take vitamins while you're drinking caffeine, that effect might not be as impactful as it would be without the use of caffeine. I've also noticed less anxiety, which adds to the improvement of my sleep quality. Considering this was a huge factor that was important to me when deciding if I wanted to quit or not, I've actually been pleasantly surprised. I feel so much more leveled out with my anxiety. It just feels so much more predictable now. It only really comes when I would expect it to come, like right before my period or when something really stressful is happening in my life. Otherwise, it's not super noticeable. And this is a really nice feeling when you've lived with anxiety your entire life. To be fair, I've done a lot of work. Once again, there is some comorbidity going into it, but I know that caffeine was a contributing factor, so I only have good things to say when it comes to cutting it out. I also actually feel like my brain is functioning better than it ever has now. I have more creativity and so much more energy, and I don't feel like that feeling is something that's just gonna escape me by the end of the day. I just feel like I have all the time in the world to utilize this positive mental state, rather than when I was using caffeine, I felt like I was on a time limit to use up all of that gas in the tank. A hard, truthful answer for if and when you should quit caffeine is yes, and right now. While there are some benefits to continuing to use it, it really does more harm than good. And I feel like if you're still watching this video, then you are at least a little bit interested in the thought of quitting. And don't click away yet. I'm not just gonna bully you guys. If you don't feel like quitting right now or ever, then don't. Realistically, not everyone is going to be in a place to do so. So if you do have the means to do it and you feel like you should do it, I would obviously recommend it. There are some specific people who I feel should quit more than others, and those people would be 1, people people who are pregnant or thinking of becoming pregnant sometime soon, as I did go into a lot of detail on people who have uteruses tend to have more struggles hormonally, and pregnancy is a huge additional hormonal change. It can be harmful to our bodies when we are trying to conceive or when we are pregnant to use caffeine. There are some studies that suggest up to 100 milligrams, even up to 200, some even up to 300 milligrams of caffeine can be safe for pregnancy, but I would really recommend against risking it because it just doesn't seem like a necessary trade-off. Number two, breastfeeding individuals. Yes, even after pregnancy, caffeine can still be dangerous to your child. About 1% of the caffeine that you drink seeps into your milk and can be obviously ingested by your breastfeeding baby. Do with that what you will, but when you take in all the effects of caffeine on yourself, a full-sized grown adult, there's something that can be said about this very small-sized human ingesting it with you. With the effects of caffeine use on your breastfeeding baby, infants can take longer to fall asleep, will wake up more often, and be overall more fussy. Up to 300 milligrams, again, is generally considered safe to avoid these effects, but again, I would recommend not risking it. I fully believe that studies are going to come out in the future saying it's not as safe as we originally thought it was. Caffeine in an infant can stay in its body for 65 to 130 hours. Very different from an adult's 3 to 7 hours. Maybe there's something I'm missing here, but I would think that any caffeine consumption in your body would definitely have an effect on your infant, considering that it lingers in their body, whereas it goes away from yours a little bit faster. I don't know. When I was reading these studies, it really turned me off to the idea of this, but maybe I'm just being dramatic or maybe I'm misunderstanding what I'm reading, but it's once again one of those things, if you have the means to quit, then why not? Number three is children. I obviously get a lot more passionate when kids are involved, but ingesting caffeine is just not a good practice for children at all in any age. 73% of children ages 2 to 12 ingest caffeine on a daily basis. That statistic is insane to me. Let's just think about all the things that people complain about with their growing children. Temper tantrums, they're not focusing in school, they don't sleep at night. Well, if 73% of kids have caffeine daily, that might just be a factor. Just a thought. Alongside sugar consumption, caffeine consumption is definitely something that's contributing to children acting out more often. If you do have children, I'd recommend not giving them any caffeine at all, and I would also recommend cutting it yourself just to lead by example. Your children are always going to have a chance of getting into something that they're not supposed to, but please try your best to set a good example for them and be a good influence on them in their developing brains and bodies. And if you are a child watching this video, get off of YouTube and go play outside and stop having sodas. Next, neurodivergent individuals. Specifically, neurodivergent individuals aren't mentioned a lot in caffeine research, but it is kind of alluded to when we are talking about the effects of caffeine on things like depression and anxiety. As someone who is considered neurodivergent, I understand the pros to having caffeine. I've never been diagnosed for ADHD, but I do have a lot of symptoms that look like it, and I definitely understand using caffeine as a tool that can just help you lock in. There are a lot of times where I can't stay focused, and I think this is true when it comes to a lot of Gen Z based on our social media usage. However, the pro of having the ability to lock in does not outweigh the con of having your depression and anxiety symptoms amplified. For those of us with depression and anxiety, the come down for caffeine sucks. Like, sometimes it can trigger an anxiety attack or a depressive episode just from how bad it is. Now, I do want to mention coffee because it is allegedly suspected to help with depression symptoms according to some studies, but it does almost seem like, once again, a personal preference kind of ordeal. Over the last couple years, when I've been noticing that I am almost fully recovered from all of my depression and anxiety symptoms, which I do believe is a consequence of a lot of healthy habits, I've also acknowledged that caffeine is a major factor to that. It is possible to get out of it, and I'm not saying that cutting caffeine will solve all of your mental health problems, but it's always worth giving it a shot. For those of us who have any kind of comorbidity, it's probably the best because anxiety is usually comorbid with a lot of other disorders, and caffeine only amplifies anxiety. And lastly, any individuals with things like stomach problems, heart problems, or anything that might be affected by caffeine a little more harshly. Caffeine can cause acid reflux, IBS, and several heart conditions. If you are struggling with any certain illness that might be linked to caffeine usage, it's safer to cut it out than to keep using it point blank. Once again, I'm not trying to bully anyone into quitting, and I will never judge anyone who continues to use caffeine after knowing all of the cons and the risk and everything, especially because I would be a hypocrite if I chose to do so. I think the most important thing is just being informed, know all the risk, and just make the best decision that you can with the knowledge you have at the time. I still choose to drink alcohol, have sugar, and not get enough sleep at night, even though I know that all of these habits are really unhealthy for me. That's just life sometimes. No one can do everything. But if you do keep telling yourself that it's fine and caffeine really isn't a problem at all, you're just doing yourself a disservice. Just be honest and then be okay with whatever decision you choose to make moving forward. But if you decide you do want to quit after all of this, how do you do it? Where do you start? Well, as I said before, everyone's case can be a little bit different. For me, I did just quit cold turkey, and it wasn't hard because I went from essentially 1 soda a day to no sodas a day. If you're having anywhere between 1 to like 50 milligrams of caffeine a day, it really shouldn't be that hard to quit cold turkey. You might struggle for at max like a week, but then it will be done and you'll be glad that you did it. If you're having anything more than that, I would recommend looking into other people's journeys and maybe just read up on some articles, maybe even talk to your doctor if it's that serious. But the general recommendation is to cut your caffeine usage by 10% at a time. If you wean off of it, it'll be easier because the only true cure for caffeine withdrawal is more caffeine. Your symptoms won't be as bad during the process, and they probably won't last as long once you have that final sip. I personally do not enjoy weaning off of anything because I hate adversity, and I would rather struggle more for a shorter period of time, so long that I don't have to deal with the process for months on end. But that's just how I am. Overall, you will probably feel worse if you quit cold turkey, but those effects won't last as long, and it really will be over before you know it. The only thing you have to do is really resist all of those cravings that your body will have, and once you get over that hump, you'll be all set. Otherwise, if you're choosing the option of weaning off, you might not have to fight as hard on a day-to-day basis, but you might find it hard to keep it up for as long as the withdrawal period is going to last. As I said, it's all a personal preference and what you feel like is better for you. That's all I have for today. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening to my yapping. If I did get any information wrong, please feel free to correct me. I'm just a girl reading research articles online and just taking her own experience into account and trying to make this all make sense to everyone else. But I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nutritionist, I don't have any credentials, so yeah, try not to take me too seriously. But again, thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like and a comment, and if you're feeling generous, you could even subscribe. I do hope to see you guys all in the next video, but if not, bye-bye.